So today I'd like to speak about pupil voice, and I've spoken about that before, but this is taking it a step further. So we've talked about pupil voice coming from the Lamb inquiry, where it expressed the importance of pupils getting a chance to air their views and be a part of the conversation that after all is about them. But if you think about it, we often talk about giving pupil a voice. Well, if we're giving them the voice, there's a power relation in that. If we think about the language, and language has been important for a long time, the language that has changed since Warnock right up to the present day is actually important in how we see things. So the idea of giving them a voice is we are the authority and we are giving that voice. So I want to take it further and talk about lived experiences. So a good way to explain this would be to talk about a child I supported for several years who had cerebral palsy. Now, I had no idea what his lived experiences were. He came across as happy, giggly, jokey, wicked sense of humour, and that was what we saw. But we didn't know what the lived experience behind that actually was. Now, one of the things that happened is his occupational therapist and physiotherapist came to school every half term, and they would do assessments on him, but we started taking walks around the school. Now, by taking those walks, we discovered just what was difficult for him that I wouldn't have even thought of. There are places around the school where there should have been handrails. I'd never noticed that they weren't there. Why would I? I didn't need to hold them. He did. So walking around the school with him and with a physio and occupational therapist, we could say, oh, well, actually, there needs to be a handrail here. Also, walking up a flight of stairs, there's a flight of stairs that I'd always thought I'm a bit unfit for these stairs, because whenever I go up these stairs, I'm always exhausted by the end of it. Well, there was a reason. The stairs were on just a really, really slight angle, and that slight angle was putting a pressure, sort of unbalance in the weight, if you like. Well, for somebody with cerebral palsy, that is so much bigger a deal, if you like, than for the average person. So we found there were other staircases that were not so difficult for him, and so he used those, and that wasn't a problem. There's no reason why he couldn't use those stairs, but we hadn't thought about it because I hadn't lived his experience. I didn't have that shared experience. So there were so many different adjustments that were made for this particular child because we actually went around the school together and discussed what it felt like. The school I was at, you had to go down some stairs, then through a tunnel that was actually taking you across the road, and then upstairs to get not only to the infants part of the school from the juniors, but also to get to the field for games and things. Well, doing that meant that this child was tired before games even started, Well, we could take him either by, sort of walk with him or in the wheelchair across the road if an adult were with him, and that actually changes his experience. So that lived experience, I've talked about Rosie several times, and she has this thing with paper, as I've mentioned before. That's not a lived experience for us. How would we know that was an issue if she didn't explain that and talk us through all of that? So it's really important to not just ask their views, but actually go deeper than that and share their views. Find out what it is really like for the child. The exhaustion at the end of the day, you could see that because she'd fall asleep. Well, that's a bit of an indication, but it's not my lived experience of the day. I'd be tired, but not in the same way. I have dyslexia, as you probably know if you've seen other videos, and that's helpful. I think of lots of strategies that would help, support strategies, coping strategies. But my lived experience of dyslexia is not necessarily the same as that of someone else. So it's not just our own lived experiences, it's about being aware that other people will have a different lived experience, and we need to get to know their lived experience. So we need to start thinking about how can we ensure that we know truly where they're coming from, so that it's not just about, oh yes, their voice was heard. It's more than that. It has to be more than that. And one of the things that came up, I was discussing this with one of my sons who's been a critical friend for me throughout, well, for years now. And he said, do we get the child to involve their friends? And I thought about that, and I thought, well, yeah, I remember working with somebody who had situational mutism, and we did various things where her friends were a part of that whole process, and it made her feel less anxious, because anxiety is a big part of situational mutism. It's otherwise known as selective mutism, but more recently it's becoming known as situational, because it takes away the implication that actually there's a choice. There isn't a choice. It's not that simple. But I involved, and there's other situations where we have involved other people. But what my son said to me is, what about in those important meetings? What about in things like an EHCP meeting, planning meeting? Do we have the child's voice, we get them to fill out a form and come to the meeting and so on. But actually being there, actually having them fully represented, what do we do? It's a real power balance if you think about it. We have got normally several adults in the room and a child. How intimidating is that? And I've been thinking about that as I do. And one of the things that occurred to me is we quite often say to the parents, you can bring somebody with if that will help, or we'll offer to be an advocate for the parent in a different meeting of theirs. I'm going to go and see blah blah blah, I'm going to see that school about this, oh, do you want me to come with? I've done that so many times. We've had parents who have brought somebody else with them just to help them cope with the meeting. But what about the child? Do we actually say to the child, have you got a friend you'd like to come with to this meeting? We talk about giving the child a voice, empowering the child, and yet at the same time as saying we're empowering the child, we're actually showing our power in the relationship. So if a child could actually go to their EHCP meeting, a planning meeting, whatever it happened to be, and bring with a trusted friend who is the one they turn to day, it's their peer, the one they're going to discuss it with. If they had the option, I'm not saying they have to bring someone with them, because obviously there'll be children who don't want to, there'll be times where it's not appropriate, but why don't we give them the choice? And I haven't given them the choice. This is something that's occurred to me this week, speaking with my son, that we could do this for our children. If we really want their voices to be in the process about them, after all, then shouldn't we be doing what we can to make them at ease with the process and making it less power balance and more equal? And if we're going to do that, then surely they should be able to have someone with them who they feel will take things down, calm them, help them to think, someone they can turn to and ask questions of, who actually has a similar lived experience of being in the classroom. Our lived experience most recently is being on the teaching side of it. It's a while since a lot of us teachers have been on the receiving side. I have through doing all my own studies, and that's helped, I have to say, and talk about lived experiences. Doing my doctorate was a great lived experience for me to then understand how some children feel about how quickly homework is marked, for example, or work generally, how the feedback is given. Much more sensitive to that as an adult who has been undergoing for several years now, both their masters and then I did my doctorate. So those processes helped me have some understanding of a lived experience. But my lived experience is that of an adult, not a child. So it's still not the same. It may help, but we need to get the lived experiences of our children into this process much more, and help them to maybe invite somebody along. It's a thought about pupil voice that I hadn't considered before, and I think it's well worth that consideration. Thank you.